Ducati's winter usually unfolds like a metronome, slow and deliberate, but the first whisper of the GP26 shattered that rhythm and sent a tremor through Bordeaux Panigale. Engineers rolled the new Desmosedici out weeks early, not with smiles but with furrowed brows, because this was acceleration born of fear rather than triumph. While rival factories were still feeding simulations into servers humming through the night, Ducati demanded asphalt, vibration, heat, and risk, compressing months into days. Marc Márquez watched from the edge of the garage, thinking this bike is arriving before my body is ready, and that scares me more than the lap time. The GP26's carbon layup was altered in a subtle new weave to manage torsional flex under extreme braking, a detail barely whispered outside the factory walls. One senior engineer muttered that the rear ride height device now reset 2 milliseconds faster, an eternity in MotoGP terms. "We cannot afford to wait for certainty," Claudio Domenicali said, his voice calm but brittle, the words hanging like condensation in cold air. The bike fired up, and its exhaust note sounded less like a roar and more like a violin tuned too tight, beautiful yet fragile. Ducati's long-cycle philosophy, once their signature, dissolved as the GP26 logged laps with unfinished bodywork and provisional software. This was not dominance on display, but anxiety wearing red paint. Marquez felt the pressure crawl under his leathers, a reminder that innovation can be a mirror reflecting vulnerability. He told himself they need my feel more than my speed, and that thought weighed heavier than any championship. Data streamed in torrents, yet everyone knew numbers alone could not translate what the front tire whispered at 320 kilometers per hour. The garage smelled of fuel and urgency, a scent no wind tunnel can simulate. Ducati's rivals watched quietly, sensing the shift. This early debut was like serving dessert before the main course, thrilling but unsettling. Expectations cracked as reality intruded. In that moment, the GP26 ceased to be a motorcycle and became a confession. And the season's tension truly began when Ducati chose motion over patience, knowing there would be no rewind. Aprilia's ascent did not arrive with fireworks or slogans, but like a quiet tide that suddenly reaches your ankles before you realize the sea has moved. Inside Ducati, the RSGP is no longer spoken of as a project or an outsider, but as a pressure point that refuses to go away. The bike from Noali gained braking stability through a revised mass damper philosophy that calms fork dive without sacrificing aggression, a solution Ducati insiders admit they underestimated. Corner entry, once Ducati territory, now belongs to Aprilia in certain conditions, where the RSGP rotates with a fluidity that looks almost casual on television but feels ruthless on datasheets. Marc Márquez studied the traces late at night, thinking they're not faster everywhere, but they're faster where it hurts. Mid-corner speed, built on an evolved rear tire load map and a new swing arm stiffness gradient, has redrawn the competitive map like an old city suddenly finding new streets. One Ducati technician admitted off record that Aprilia's edge comes from how softly the bike talks to the tire at maximum lean, a conversation Ducati is still trying to decode. "If we arrive late, we don't arrive second, we arrive lost," a Ducati executive said bluntly, the sentence cutting through optimism like a cold draft. This realization tightened the walls around every Ducati meeting. Aprilia was no longer chasing, it was forcing reactions. Ducati's leadership understood that missing even one critical test window in 2026 could shift development momentum beyond recovery. Marquez felt that urgency radiate outward, a heat that had nothing to do with engines. He wondered how many championships are decided not by races, but by decisions made in February. The RSGP's progress became a mirror, reflecting Ducati's own vulnerabilities. It was like watching a younger pianist master the same piece with fewer notes and more feeling. Confidence began to share space with unease. Ducati accelerated not because it wanted to, but because Aprilia had changed the tempo. In that silent comparison, the championship future narrowed to weeks. And anxiety took a clear shape, painted not in red, but in Aprilia black. In an era obsessed with data, Ducati has learned the uncomfortable truth that numbers can describe everything except sensation. The GP26 generates terabytes of information per test, yet something essential remains missing without Marc Márquez on the bike. Test riders can repeat laps, simulators can model forces, but none of them can explain why the front tire feels nervous before it actually loses grip. Marquez can. He senses micro-movements in the swing arm pivot measured in fractions of a millimeter, vibrations that appear only as static noise on telemetry. Sitting in the garage, he thinks this bike speaks my language, but only if I answer it. A little-known detail inside Ducati's project is that the GP26's weight distribution favors extreme front load under braking, shifting mass forward earlier than on previous Desmosedici generations. That architecture exists because Marquez is willing to brake deeper, harder, and longer than anyone else, forcing the front to carry impossible stress. He tells us things the sensors don't even know how to ask, an engineer admitted, half in awe, half in frustration. Front-end chatter for Marquez is not a problem but a vocabulary. Each vibration is a syllable that guides development. Without him, Ducati's direction becomes interpretative rather than precise. The bike has been shaped around his instincts like a tailored suit waiting for a body that hasn't arrived yet. He knows this, and the knowledge weighs on him heavier than expectation. Marquez wonders, am I shaping the bike, or is the bike shaping my comeback? Simulators smooth out fear. Marquez amplifies it, using discomfort as information. His riding style compresses decision-making into instinct. The GP26 needs that violence of clarity to mature. Otherwise, Ducati risks polishing a surface without correcting its structure. It's like tuning a grand piano without a musician to strike the keys. Development continues, but something fundamental rings hollow. And that absence, more than any lap time, exposes the fragility beneath Ducati's technical brilliance. The tension reached its most fragile point when innovation collided head-on with flesh, bone, and damaged ligament. Marc Márquez's right shoulder was no longer an abstract medical report, but a daily negotiation between ambition and limitation. The injury had robbed him of rotational freedom, making certain braking angles feel like forcing a rusted hinge. Doctors warned that repeated microtrauma could compromise long-term stability, advice delivered calmly but carrying irreversible consequences. Ducati, meanwhile, needed feedback now, not in theory, not later. Marquez lay on the physio table at night thinking, if I rush this, I may never ride the same again. Ligament damage is deceptive in MotoGP because pain can fade before strength truly returns, and that illusion tempts risk. A little-known technical reality is that extreme front-end loading places asymmetric stress through the shoulder during trail braking, multiplying strain even when a rider feels fine. You can ride through pain, but you can't ride through instability, his doctor told him, the sentence landing harder than any crash. Ducati's urgency turned the injury into more than a personal battle. It became a strategic fault line. Engineers spoke in numbers, doctors in probabilities, Marquez in silence. Each delayed test widened uncertainty inside the GP26 project. Each early return carried the possibility of altering his riding style permanently, compromising the very feedback Ducati needed. He felt torn, knowing the bike required his aggression while his body demanded restraint. The conflict was like trying to tune a race engine with cracked pistons, powerful but unsustainable. Ethics entered the garage quietly, without banners or outrage. Marquez asked himself, who do I become if I ignore this warning? Ducati faced the same question in different words. Innovation thrives on pressure, but pressure has a human cost. In that narrow space between recovery and responsibility, the future of both rider and machine balanced on a single decision. The call did not come through the usual hierarchy, and that alone made it seismic. Claudio Domenicali chose to bypass managers, engineers, and protocols, dialing Marc Márquez directly in a moment that rewrote Ducati's internal rulebook. There was no script, no corporate language, only urgency compressed into a human voice. Marquez listened, thinking, if the CEO calls me himself, something inside Ducati is breaking. Domenicali did not ask for race pace or heroics, only proximity, only sensation, only 10 laps that could anchor an entire project. Marc, we don't need miracles, we need direction, he said, the words stripped of ceremony and heavy with consequence. That request exposed the depth of Ducati's fear more than any leaked memo ever could. A little-known technical truth hovered behind the call. Without rider input, the GP26's engine brake strategy and inertia management risk diverging in opposite directions, creating a bike fast on paper and unstable in reality. 10 laps from Marquez could align months of development, or undo them. He felt the weight of that paradox settle into his injured shoulder. Ducati's leadership was admitting, indirectly but clearly, that the GP26 lacked a compass without him. This was not pressure applied publicly, but privately, where it cuts deeper. Marquez weighed the ask carefully, sensing that those 10 laps were not a test but a confession. The situation felt like adjusting a telescope without knowing where the stars actually were. Engineers waited, silent, knowing no simulation could replace this moment. Domenicali's intervention collapsed the distance between boardroom and pit lane. It blurred responsibility and urgency into a single request. Marquez wondered, am I being trusted or cornered? The GP26 idled in the background of every thought, unfinished and impatient. Ducati had revealed its vulnerability not in a press release, but in a phone call. And in that quiet exchange, the season's balance shifted irreversibly. The final tension crystallized not on track, but behind closed doors, where deadlines speak louder than lap times. Gigi Dall'Igna, usually measured and controlled, delivered an ultimatum that leaked like oil onto hot asphalt, impossible to ignore. The message was clear. Development could no longer wait for perfect conditions. Marquez sensed it immediately, thinking this is the moment where absence becomes a decision, not a delay. Ducati stood at a fork where both paths carried risk, but only one preserved ambition. If Marquez returned before Sepang, the GP26 could be sculpted with precision, every braking phase and corner entry aligned with his instinctive violence. If not, Ducati would be forced into conservative defaults, prioritizing stability over potential. A little-known technical consequence loomed beneath that choice. Locking the bike's inertia and engine brake maps too early would freeze development for half a season. We either define the bike now, or we defend ourselves later, Dall'Igna reportedly said, the tone sharper than usual. That sentence echoed through the factory. Marquez felt the pressure not as fear, but as responsibility, a far heavier burden. He asked himself how many championships are lost before the first race. Rival teams sensed opportunity, knowing early season momentum often defines the psychological order of the grid. Ducati's engineers watched the calendar like surgeons watching a pulse monitor. The GP26 was ready to be guided, but not yet committed. Starting conservatively would mean surrendering initiative, reacting instead of dictating. It was like launching a ship without trimming the sails, safe but slow. Marquez understood that his timing could shape not just the bike, but the narrative of 2026. The tension escaped the garage and entered the paddock's bloodstream. Every rumor amplified it. Ducati's future narrowed to a window measured in days. And at that fork in the road, the championship stopped being hypothetical and became inevitable.